I'm excited to introduce this year's NMT theme and the topic of our keynote today, building community through REC. So historically, Jamaat Khana has been our communal anchor, fostering bonds through prayer, celebration, reflection, and our children grow up observing and then emulating these community building practices within Jamaat Khana. However, as we've all experienced the recent global pandemic, much of our youth's experiences from Jamaat Khana has shifted from in-person to virtual. And now there's a need to relearn community building within the Ismaili community. REC, primarily for our youth, plays a pivotal role in fostering friendships and a sense of family. But we have, in our efforts to professionalize the RE system, potentially made REC more about transactions than relationships. So today the question is, how can we refocus REC on becoming a nurturing community for our youth? For the rest of today, we will have a special speaker join us in addressing these questions and understanding the importance of community from a metaphysical, spiritual, and social perspective. And then we will break out into two workshops, one that discusses best practices on building community with our peers from across the nation, and another that presents findings within our respective regions. For now, I would like to introduce our keynote speaker, M.A. Lakhani. Mr. Lakhani, Rai Saib M.A. Lakhani QC, is a legal advocate, scholar, teacher, and author. He read law at Cambridge University in England, both as an undergraduate and as a postgraduate before moving to Canada. He has practiced law as a barrister in Vancouver for 45 years at all levels, including the Supreme Court of Canada. In honor of his legal skills, he received the distinction of the designation King's Counsel. Beyond his legal career, Mr. Lakhani founded Sacred Web, a leading journal in metaphysics and religion. Now in its 50th volume, Sacred Web has been endorsed by King Charles III, the Dalai Lama, and the professors Syed Hussein Nasser, William Chittick, and Karen Armstrong. His paper on Muslim Foundations of Justice won first prize at the Imam Ali International Conference in Tehran. Mr. Lakhani's dedication to the Ismaili community is profound. He has served in numerous Ismaili roles, including the National Council for Canada and the International Ismaili Personal Law Task Force. During the Golden Jubilee appointments, he trained global national leaders at the IAS orientation on faith's esoteric dimensions. In 2013, he delivered the opening keynote address at the Canadian Wyzine Conference in Toronto. In 2020, he addressed global leaders on ethics and personal law, especially regarding the ethical wealth transfer guidelines of international CAB. His latest contribution in April of 2023 involved training the Canadian Wyzine on the relationship between Deen, Dunya, and Ismaili ethics. Currently, he is on the International Conciliation and Arbitration Board, that's ICAB. Mr. Lakhani is the author of 4 books on metaphysics and religion, including the one we will be discussing today, which is titled Faith and Ethics, the Vision of the Ismaili Imamat. This book was published in 2018 on the occasion of the Imam's Diamond Jubilee by the Institute of Ismaili Studies. And with that, welcome, Mr. Lakhani. We are truly honored to have you join us today. Our talk today is entitled, as you know, Tawheed as the foundation of the Ummah in the Ismaili context. It's nice to have you.
It's nice to be here.
My first question for us today is, would you help us understand the connection between the concept of Tawheed and the concept of Ummah, and explain to us how the principles of faith inform the meaning of community?
Well, Chairman Murad's Vice Chair Onsek Al-Shamsa and national team, it's a pleasure to be speaking to the engine of RE in the US. I was in fact slated to speak at the IWTP in Dubai at this very time, and I turned down their invitation partly because I had made a commitment to you, but also because of the importance of the topic that you have assigned me. This is a topic that goes to the heart of our faith. I'll just begin with a quotation. There is a handout that I have asked to be circulated, so you'll see some of these quotations in that handout. It's from a speech made by Maulana Hajr Imam at the Burnaby Center opening in 1985, where he said, "A wide, all-embracing vision of the brotherhood of man and the unity of God is among the most fundamental of the faith's teachings. The brotherhood of man being the notion of the Ummah, the unity of God being the notion of Tawheed." And this relates essentially to the two principal dimensions of religion. What is religion about? Religion is about two things. It is firstly finding out what is real, and that has to do with doctrine. And the essential doctrine in all faith traditions is that reality is intrinsically one. Intrinsically, because there is a transcendent reality. But that transcendent reality is also our ground of being, so it's also immanent. And that combination of transcendence and immanence is Tawheed. It is our vertical relationship to God. When I say vertical, I mean we need to go deep within ourselves in order to ascend. We do this through Iman, through dhikr, through taqwa. The second component of religion is once we have discerned the reality in which we live, that reality of oneness that is Tawheed, then we must be at one with that reality. It means living harmoniously as an ummah. This is the notion of universal brotherhood. It also involves the notion of caring for our environment. This is the horizontal relationship that we have, as opposed to the vertical relationship. And this we express through submission, in the sense that we are submitting to the needs of the whole rather than to our individual needs. This is the essence of Islam. And we express this in our conduct, which is ihsan. So it is vital for ITREBs to educate the Jamaat on the meaning of community and how to foster communality in these challenging times. And that is done by essentially vivifying our faith so that we can live the ethics of our faith, so that we can bring din into dunya, as Hajr Imam has said. Hajr Imam's definition of ethics in one of his speeches was that it is a bridge between din and dunya, and community, or the ummah, actually expresses that. Let me just explain a bit more about the concepts themselves. So, Tawheed is intrinsic unity. It's the batini expression of our relationship to reality. Well, Ummah is the extrinsic or Zahiri expression of our relationship with oneness. The notion of Tawheed, it comes from an Arabic root meaning oneness. It means literally addressing the oneness of reality, while Ummah comes from an Arabic root which you find in the word or mother. It is a matrix, a sustaining source like a mother is. And it also is a cognate of the term imam. So imam and ummah are also related terms. And imam, in essence, represents a model or an exemplar. And in fact, in the Holy Quran, there are several passages where the word ummah is synonymous with the word religion. I'll give you a couple of examples. Surah Al-Baqarah, second surah, verse 213. All mankind were once one single community. Kana nasu ummatan wahidatan. And then they began to differ. So God sent messengers to them to harmonize their divergent views. This is Surah Al-Baqarah, but notice that the word ummah wahadatan, is used as the term religion. And the second is in the Surah Anbiya, Surah 21, verse 92. Indeed, your religion is one religion, and I am your Lord, so worship me. Inna hazihi ummatakum ummatan wahidatan. Again, the term religion is synonymous with the term community. So as religious educators, it is vital to what you do to understand this connection between our extrinsic relationship to Tawheed in the form of Ummah. Let me also give you some quotations from Maulana Hazrima. At the Asia Society address in 1985, Maulana Hazrima said, Islam does not deal in dichotomies, but in an all-encompassing unity. Spirit and body are one, man and nature are one. Now, I emphasize for you the phrase all-encompassing unity. Why? Because that expression is a Quranic expression. The expression, Ar-Rahmati wasiyat kulla shahin, my rahmat is all-encompassing. My rahmat encompasses everything. You will find in the Surah Al-Araf, the 7th Surah, verse 156. And another place, the Holy Quran says in Surah Al-An'am, the 6th Surah, verse 12, Katab al-nafsi ar-rahmata, I have decreed rahmat as a law binding on myself. The term Allah is interchangeable with the term rahmah. And the idea of rahmah is the idea of a womb, a nurturing womb, that in which, like the notion of then the notion of community, that which nurtures us. So this notion of an all-encompassing unity is an all-encompassing unity of a binding wholeness by which we can relate to each other through the bond of love. As you know, Maulana Hazrima, in his various speeches and in his vision, has promoted the notion of a common humanity. The Imamat vision is of integral unity. As I said in the last chapter of my book, Faith and Ethics, I titled it Global Convergence, because the Imam's vision is one of global convergence of universal brotherhood. We find that in the preface to, in the preamble to the Constitution as well. And of course, AKDN, which the Imam has created for us, is a bridge builder of communities, but it is also a connector. And as Maulana Hazram said at an interview in Cairo in 1986, I quote, in Islam, there is no dichotomy between the spiritual and the temporal. He goes on, and this is the important passage, I have endeavored all my life to live and work in accordance with this integrated philosophy, the idea of an integrated philosophy of wholeness. And he explains AKDN in a preface to a book in 2007, where he says AKDN has always attempted to act as a connector between East and West in terms of its cultural initiatives, and between North and South as far as social and economic development projects are involved. So cultural initiatives, think of this as our being united with say, Western values which are trying to learn about Islam. Our values are different. North and South, think of it as the notion of noblesse oblige. Those who have more have a responsibility that goes with it to improve the quality of life of others as a way of building community. So I hope that will give you some sort of an answer to the connection between Tawheed and Ummah.
Thank you for this. I think that just in this short, answer, there is so many things to pick up on. And I know this is a lifelong endeavor to be able to understand truly these concepts and to bring them into our work and our faith and the way that we live our lives, right? This sense of Tawheed as up and down and Ummah as, across. And really, these ideas that you pull out that the Imam has shared of the community as a bridge, examples of this through our Constitution and through AKDN. I mean, there's so much to unpack. And I think, for me personally, when I think about Tawheed, I mean, there are so many, every time I reconsider this, I see it in a different light, and this idea of oneness as being, a part of one community or one reality. I think there's there's so much to think about and to really deeply reflect as we turn to making it tangible. Since you're such a fan of quotes, I wanted to pull some from your book and see if you can kind of help us understand your thought process behind this. So I'll put it up on the slides in a second, or you'll see it on the slides. There's a quote from this book that we were talking about that is from the Persian Sufi Sadi. It says, "The children of Adam are as limbs of each other, having been created from a single essence. When the calamities of time affect one limb, the other limbs cannot remain unaffected. If you have no sympathy for the trouble of others, you are unworthy to be called a human." Tell me, why did you choose this particular poem as your book's epigraph? And how does this theme relate to the communal cohesion that you've been talking to us about?
Well, thank you for that question. Yes, I thought long and hard about this particular epigraph to the book, and I selected it because the book is titled Faith and Ethics. The epigraph, of course, is from the Gulistan. Sadi was writing in the 1200s, so 8 centuries ago, but he was essentially reflecting the ideas of the Holy Prophet. There are, in fact, 2 hadith that contain the same idea. One is in Sahih Muslim 2586, where the Prophet says, "The Muslims are like a single man. If the eye is afflicted, then the whole body is afflicted. If the head is afflicted, then the whole body is afflicted." And the second hadith is from Sahih Bukhari 5665, the parable of the believers in their affection, mercy, and compassion for each other is that of a body. When any limb aches, the whole body reacts with sleeplessness and fever. So essentially, let's just look at this passage that I've chosen, the Beni Adam passage. The first is the idea that we're limbs of each other, which we found in the hadith. Now, if we all have limbs as human beings, and if our limb is hurting, then the whole body feels the pain. Why is that? Because essentially we are integrated as human beings. So too, we are told by Bani Adam and the Prophet that the children of Adam, in other words, all of humanity, are like a single body. Why? Because they have been created of one essence. This is the first verse of the Surah Al-Nisa. We've been created from a single soul. And so it is critical that we feel the pain of others, that we empathize with others in order to be true to our humanity, to be considered worthy of being called a human being. We must be humane. And this is of the essence of building a community. When I was drafting the ethical wealth transfer guidelines for ITREB, the body that I currently serve on, I was the head of the Ismaili Personal Law Task Force. I introduced a phrase, connectedness and caring. The idea is that we have an ethos of connectedness and caring, which you will find in this excerpt from Bani Adam. We are limbs of each other, created of a single essence, so we are intrinsically connected. We share the same ground of being. And so when we behave in the world, when we decide what to do in the world and how to conduct our relationships, we must be true to honoring that ground of being. We must care for each other. So this requires subordinating the focus on the egoic self to the focus on the whole. And there's a passage that I want to quote to you from Maulana Haj Imam. He's often cited Imam Ali. And this is what he said at his AUC commencement address in Cairo in 2006. He says, in his teachings, Hazrat Ali emphasized that no honor is like knowledge. And then he added that No belief is like modesty and patience. No attainment is like humility. No power is like forbearance. And no support is more reliable than consultation. Now, Maulana Hazrat goes on to explain that. And he says, notice that the virtues endorsed by Hazrat Ali are qualities which subordinate the self and emphasize others: modesty, patience, humility, forbearance, and consultation. What he thus is telling us is that we find knowledge best by admitting first what it is we do not know and by opening our minds to what others can teach us. So this issue of subordinating the self is important, but equally important is the notion of opening ourselves up from this epistemic closure, from this closed self that prevents us from knowing more. And once we do that, we can then realize our connection with others. Maulana Hazrat has also spoken at the Ogden Lecture at Brown University in 2014 about the relationship between knowledge gaps and empathy gaps. He says knowledge gaps so often run the risk of becoming empathy gaps. The struggle to remain empathetically open to the other in a diversifying world is a continuing struggle of central importance to us. And let me just say one thing. One of my favorite hadith, in fact, it's attributed to Imam Ali, demonstrates actually the essence of the faith and the essence of what is required. I don't think it's in the handout I sent you, but I do remember the piece very well. It goes like this: who seeketh me, findeth me. Who findeth me, knoweth me. Who knoweth me, loveth me. Who loveth me, him I love. Whom I love, him I slay. Whom I slay, him must I requite. Whom I must requite, myself am his requital. Now, this is a beautiful hadith of Imam Ali's. Of course, it is as though God was speaking, so it is a hadith Qudsi, a sacred hadith. And the idea that who knoweth me, loveth me, knowledge leads to love. When we know profoundly, we end up loving. This is actually the thesis of Sayyid Hussain Nasser's Gifford lectures, which became his book, Knowledge and the Sacred. It was the idea that knowledge very profoundly is love. And then whom I love, him I slay, because what happens is that you subordinate yourself. You end up basically serving the whole, which includes you. So anyway, that was the meaning behind the Bani Adam choice.
I've never heard that Hadith Qudsi before, but I am deeply thinking about it. This is such a fascinating conversation, right? Because, you say that we need to subordinate, but stay open, right? So to me, that sounds like go low, stay open, right? Keep sort of head down, right? But so, your feelers out so that you are able to be receptive to, I would think, even the pain of the other limbs, right? Sometimes, when we feel pain, we medicate, right? Or we try to avoid, or we, redirect so that we're not having to face some of the aches and pains of ourselves or the people around us. And I really appreciate this injunction to stay open, stay low, stay open, so you can hear and be present to the pain, right, that comes from love, right? This idea of really deeply knowing means deeply loving, means deeply hurting. I think they're inextricable. But I think also, as you mentioned, right, in pain, there's also requital. And so it's not just a, tanking journey, but one that takes us, up and down, but in a space of love and openness and empathy. And that's a really beautiful way to share that with us. you mentioned in the answer to this also, this idea, it's really logical idea, right? That if our arm is hurting and our body is hurting, and the same can be then paralleled to the human race, because we've been created from this single soul. So I know that all of us on this call are probably really familiar with this Quranic ayat because the Imam has included it in the Golden Jubilee emblem. So the verse is, "O mankind, be mindful of your duty to your Lord, who created you from a single soul, and from it created its mate, and from the twain hath spread abroad a multitude of men and women." And then 10 years later, for his Diamond Jubilee, he used the Quranic ayat, "O humankind, indeed we created you male and female, and we made you diverse peoples and tribes so that you may come to know one another." I know we've talked at length about Tawheed and community, but I don't feel like we're done yet. So can you tell us a little bit more about the relevance of these particular verses to this topic of community that we've been gathering?
Yes, of course. The verse from the Surah Al-Nisa, and it's not the whole verse, by the way, there is a second part to that verse, which is equally important, and I'll just mention that in a moment. But the significance of the emblem, the Golden Jubilee emblem, of course, is the idea of a common humanity, that we have a common spiritual patrimony, we have a common spiritual matrix, and you see it reflected that within diversity, there is this notion of oneness. You find it in the motto in the United States seal, "A pluribus unum," out of many one. The second part of the Surah An-Nisa, which is not quoted in your slide and was not part of the Golden Jubilee emblem, is equally important because it basically says that be mindful of your obligations to God, because it is that is how you derive your obligations to each other. And in a world like today, where everyone is clamoring for rights, it is important to remind ourselves that no rights exist outside the framework of our relationship with God. So that's the first thing. The Diamond Jubilee emblem, which is essentially the same idea, is also emphasizing the notion of pluralism. So in addition to the cosmopolitan ideal of diverse peoples and tribes, it goes on to say, so that you may come to know one another. The purpose of creation is so that you may come to know one another. And that is important. So let me just quote you something that Haj Imam said in the Peterson lecture in Atlanta in 2008. He says, "The Holy Quran addresses itself not only to Muslims, but to the entirety of the human race when it says, 'O mankind, be careful of your duty to your Lord who created you from one single soul, and from it created its mate, and from them twain hath spread abroad a multitude of men and women.'" Then he goes on to explain, these words reflect a deeply spiritual insight, a divine imperative, if you will. And I underline that, a divine imperative, which in my view should undergird our educational commitments. So I emphasize that as you are educators. And it goes on, it is because we see humankind despite our differences as children of God and born from one soul, that we insist on reaching beyond traditional boundaries as we deliberate, communicate, and educate internationally. So this notion of coming to know one another, it is, in spite of our differences, it is to seek that sort of transcendent ground of being that connects us. And at the Peterson lecture, Hazrat Imam also said, and this is a key quote that I would urge you to take on board, it is our differences that both define us and connect us. Now, if you just pause and you think, well, we understand how our differences define us. We're all individuals, we're all different from each other. But how do our differences connect us? what does Maulana Haj Imam mean by that? Well, the answer is in the Holy Quran. In the Quran, it says that when we are created of attributes that come from the divine treasury. And those attributes are loaned to us in limited measure. And they're loaned to us so that we can be individuals and work with each other in complementary ways. One person can do something that another person cannot do. And so we should pool our resources and work together for the whole. And by stepping outside our own limitations, we can learn better what it means to know each other and to know God. So this is the idea of cosmopolitanism. Cosmopolitanism, the word cosmos meaning a universe, and the polis, how we live as a single universe. The cosmopolitan ethic is something Haj Imam defined in the La Fontaine Baldwin lecture when he said, what we must seek and share is what I have called a cosmopolitan ethic, a readiness to accept the complexity of human society. I'll just editorialize here. The complexity of human society is that we are all different. We're all individuals. We have all been loaned different attributes from the divine treasury. He goes on. It is an ethic which balances rights and duties. So, in other words, we don't have rights outside of another person's rights. We have duties to them. We have to work together in a complementary way. Then he goes on. It is an ethic for all peoples. It will not surprise you to have me say that such an ethic can grow with enormous power out of the spiritual dimensions of our lives. In acknowledging the immensity of the divine, we will also come to acknowledge our human limitations, the incomplete nature of human understanding. End quote. What he's saying essentially is that the whole that we are participating in and which includes us, so it is a part of our ground of being, is much greater than us. And we must approach that wholeness with humility and in a spirit of service so that we can come to know each other. And what do we do when we have differences? Well, that is what pluralism is about. And so at the opening of the Ismaili Center in Dubai in 2008, he says about pluralism, it sees the desire to explore and connect as a way to learn and grow, not to dilute our identities, but to enrich our self-knowledge. So again, I'll just editorialize there, not to dilute our identities, because we are all individuals. We are all creatures of God that have been gifted with things that others have not. And we're not meant to dilute our identities, but enrich our self-knowledge, learn about ourselves and learn about each other, and so learn about the attributes of God, and so learn about God, and so build community. Then he goes on to say, this ethic emanates ultimately from a relationship to the divine, which inspires a deep sense of personal humility and a relationship to humankind, which is infused with a spirit of generous service and mutual respect.
You are dropping gem after gem. All right, so you gave us a lot to think about in this one. And I want to pull out two things that I heard that are kind of helping me to at least synthesize, and hopefully it will for the audience too. So you pointed out earlier in your answer about this, based on the second verse up here, the Diamond Jubilee emblem, this idea that, the purpose of creation is to know one another, right? And earlier in in our conversation earlier, we were talking about the Hadith al-Qudsi, about to know is to love, is to slay, is to requite. And it really makes me think about, this idea that if the purpose of creation is to know, and if we parallel that Hadith al-Qudsi and we say that, well, then to know one another is to love one another. And to love one another then is to, you slay and you requite in that process, that we're here to serve each other, but also to uplift each other, which makes me think about, that second piece that you said, that key quote of, our differences define, obviously, but they also connect, right? And this, I really love the way you take this spiritual overlay. I've always thought about, I always tell people I can bake, or I can do all the cooking, but if my fridge breaks down or my appliances break down, like I need somebody else there to be able, I can't do everything. I can't bake for you and fix my appliances if they break. But you've sort of added this like spiritual overlay to this of what that means on a human spiritual level, right? That, I may not have a lot of patience, but I have, organizational skills, and we can work together to do what we need to do. And so I'm thinking deeply about this, and about the ways in which our differences connect us, which is something that we can hear, but it's a different thing to start to really think about and understand. I want to push back a little bit though, because, there's this great, yes, we can all get along and, we need each other, but the reality is also, it's not that simple, right? And, in your various talks and writings, you have also mentioned the tensions that exist between this need for individual freedom, and especially given that we live in the West, this is, at the forefront of some of the things that we're around all the time, right? So there's a tension between individual freedom and the need for belonging, but also, the need for a community, both self-serving and as our obligation. And so I want to ask you, how can the Jamaat build a harmonious sense of community, especially in a time that is, and this is to quote the Imam, Ivora's speech in 2006, increasingly cynical, right? He says that the Imam says we're increasingly cynical, not we, but the situation where people are marginalized and the world is increasingly polarized. I feel like maybe every generation says this, but I feel like this is unique to our time where we are so polarized and we're so sort of in a unique space where we're looking at some of the real dredges of human nature. So, can you speak to some of the guidance that the Imam has offered on this topic, especially as it relates to the West?
This is an excellent question because, we can only speak so long about theory, and we have to get into practical issues and the programmatic. And so we have to understand what the spirit of the age is. And you quoted the Evora message. I'll just quote it more fully. He asks this question: how in an increasingly cynical time, that's where your question picked up, how in an increasingly cynical time can we inspire people to a new set of aspirations reaching beyond rampant materialism, the new relativism, self-serving individualism, and resurgent tribalism? Now, the Evora address was in February 2006. A few months later, in May 2006, Haj Imam addressed this same issue at Columbia University. And this is how he asked the question then: how can we inspire people to reach beyond rampant materialism, self-indulgent individualism, and unprincipled relativism? So at that time, in 2006, at two different places, he was asking this same question with little tweaks along the way. But it's interesting. What is he saying there? Firstly, he calls this a cynical time. What is a cynical time? A cynical time is when people are bitter, people feel that we're not pulling together, community is fraying, as T.S. Eliot put it in The Second Coming, the center cannot hold, things fall apart. So we're living in an age that is basically pulling us apart. Why is it pulling us apart? And he tells us rampant materialism. So what does he mean by rampant materialism? Materialism in the sense of, we have lost sight of the face of God. We only see the world of matter. Why do we only see the world of matter? Well, science, a particular kind of science, has a role to play there. That is not true science, it's scientism. Secularism has a role to play there. Not soft secularism, which Hajimam is not against, but hard secularism which rejects faith and leads essentially to atheism. And if you look at the kind of preoccupations of a materialistic society, consumerist society, facile habits, all that kind of stuff. So we have rampant materialism. Secondly, he says we have unprincipled. The notion of unprincipled relative is very key, because it is the idea that we have lost our connection with objectivity. What we're doing now is, instead of addressing issues that are confronting us through a sense of principle, I mean, let's not forget that the Imam is the possessor of ta'wil. Ta'wil is the ability to trace things back to the awal, to the origin, to their principial origin. We have lost the sense of principles. And so what we're doing is we are basically saying, well, that's your opinion, this is my opinion, and we have a relativism, an unprincipled relativism. That leads to the next thing, self-indulgent individualism, because when it's your ideas versus my ideas, you know, I might decide to serve myself rather than to serve a common humanity. And that will inevitably lead to conflicts. And so you have resurgent tribalism. This is a very trenchant analysis that in 2006, Hajimam posed. It has precursors, because at the Sirat conference, many years earlier, in 1976, I think it was, this is what he said. And keep in mind what is happening in the United States and in the West today. Think of the occidentalization of values when I read this out. He says, I have observed in the Western world a deeply changing pattern of human relations. Now, this is very important for us because we're trying to figure out how to build community. What is happening in terms of changing patterns of human relations? He goes on. The anchors of moral behavior appear to have dragged to such depths that they no longer hold firm the ship of life. What was once wrong is now simply unconventional, and for the sake of individual freedom, must be tolerated. What is tolerated soon becomes accepted. Contrarily, what was once right is now viewed as outdated, old-fashioned, and is often the target of ridicule. He goes on. In the face of this changing world, which was once a universe to us and is now no more than an overcrowded island. Let me just pause there. The difference between a universe, which is the idea of an integrated wholeness, and an overcrowded island, which is, you can think of it in terms of my territory, my nation, my tribe, etc. Okay? In the face of this changing world, which was once a universe to us and is now no more than an overcrowded island, confronted with a fundamental challenge to our understanding of time. Now, what does that mean? What is the challenge, the fundamental challenge to our understanding of time? In Islam, we are not bound by time. We are bound by the timeless. And things are timely because they are timeless. So the idea that we take away eternal values and come down only to the level of temporal values is what he's saying. Confronted with a fundamental challenge to our understanding of time, surrounded by a foreign fleet of cultural and ideological ships which have broken loose. What a powerful phrase. A foreign fleet, not ours, not part of our tradition, a foreign fleet of cultural and ideological, both important words. Ships which have broken loose. I ask, do we have a clear firm, and precise understanding of what Muslim society is to be in times to come. Now, when he asked that at Sirhat in 1976, he gave an answer. And if, as I believe, the answer is uncertain for us in the modern world, where else can we search then? Than in the Holy Quran and in the example of Allah's last and final prophet. So, before I come to the Quran and the Prophet to answer that for you and to explain that a bit better, let me just go back to what he was saying in 2006. So after asking these questions in Evora and Colombia, he provides answers. So in Evora, when he's asking how can we inspire people to rise above these issues of the modern world, he goes on to answer it. He says, a deepening sense of spiritual commitment and the ethical framework that goes with it, in other words, faith and ethics, will be a central requirement if we are to find our way through the minefields and the quicksands of modern life. Then he talks basically to you at ITREB. A strengthening of religious institutions should be a vital part of this process. To be sure, freedom of religion is a critical value in a pluralistic society, but if freedom of religion deteriorates into freedom from religion, he's talking about hard secularism, then societies will find themselves lost in a bleak and unpromising landscape with no compass, no roadmap, and no sense of ultimate direction. So that was his answer at Evora. He deals with the same thing at Colombia 3 months later. And he answers the question this way. One answer, he says, is to augment our focus on personal prerogatives and individual rights with an expanded concern for personal responsibilities and communal goals. A passion for justice, the quest for equality, a respect for tolerance, a dedication to human dignity. These are universal human values which are broadly shared across divisions of class, race, language, faith, and geography. They constitute what classical philosophers in the East and West alike have described as human virtue, not merely the absence of negative restraints on individual freedom, but a set of positive responsibilities, moral disciplines, which prevent liberty from turning into license. Now, this is important because you asked me in your question to address the question of freedom. And I want to say something about that. So freedom exists for a purpose. If you were God and you were designing a universe with creatures whom you wanted to love you would give them freedom because love cannot be compelled. Love has to be an act of one's own free will. But if you give your creatures free will, there is the danger that they will abuse that free will. And that too is baked into reality. And so we're often busy blaming God and saying, why doesn't God come to my assistance? It is human beings that are often behaving badly. And we are limited creatures. We are not God ourselves. So we will suffer the privations of existence, what is known as suffering. Our lives will end with a death. We all will experience privation and limitation. But freedom can also be transgressive, as Hazrat Imam says. And when it is transgressive, people will become increasingly isolated, individualistic instead of just individuals. NPR in 2020 reported that 60% of Americans are lonely. There's an epidemic of loneliness in the United States. Our community is not immune from that. We have conflicts. I'm in the Conciliation Arbitration Board. I was the first chair at the regional level. I served on the national level. I'm on the international level. I have seen a number of conflicts, and we've gone to Hazrat Imam and presented the data to him. And Hazrat Imam has identified that the issue is that we need to educate for ethics. And I said to Hazrat Imam at a meeting that I had it was at the end of the Diamond Jubilee in Lisbon, after the signing of the Divan instrument. I said, Khudavand, but we don't educate for principles. And he said, and Haj Imam said, that all comes down to love, which is a very profound statement. Haj Imam has also said, talking about the type of world we're living in. It's a world, by the way, I've described in one of my writings as being where the spirit of the age is pitted against the spirit itself. And Imam has said that our three most important public enemies are ignorance, arrogance, and insensitivity. So that points to the work that that ITREB needs to do. As antidotes to these, we need to promote knowledge, humility, and empathy. So I said that I would go back to the Sirat issue, and Haj Imam has said that we should search the Holy Quran and the example of Prophet Muhammad. In the Holy Quran, Surah 49, verse 10, it says, all believers are but brethren. Therefore, make peace between your brethren and be conscious of God. So have taqwa, so that you might be graced with his mercy. In verse 21 that I've quoted, sorry, verse 92 of Surah 21 that I've quoted you before, your religion is one religion and I'm your Lord, so worship me. A famous hadith, Sahih Bukhari 13, none of you has faith until he loves for his brother what he loves for himself. But there are examples also from the Sirah, and I want to just mention a few that are very key. The first is the Constitution of Medina, which was a model of liberty, equality, fraternity, tolerant pluralism. It allowed freedoms of religion, speech, assembly, redress of grievances. It provided a model for equality and inclusiveness between men and women, between diverse races. It is the model for building an ummah of universal brotherhood and pluralism. The second is the farewell sermon. The second example is the farewell sermon of the Prophet, where he speaks about equality. And I'll just give you a quote. All of mankind is from Adam and Eve. No Arab has superiority over a non-Arab, and no non-Arab has any superiority over an Arab. Also, a white has no superiority over a black, nor a black have any superiority over a white, except by piety and good action. That is the only thing that distinguishes us in terms of our otherwise intrinsic equality and dignity. And our dignity is something that only we can give away by lack of piety and lack of good action. Then he goes on, the Prophet says, learn that every Muslim is a brother to every other Muslim and that Muslims constitute one brotherhood. And this is what he says about women. I could speak a long time about women, but the issue about women is that he was giving rights to women long before these rights were acquired by women in the West. I mean, in 1872 and 1880, or I think it's 1870 and 1882, I can't remember which, we had the two Married Women's Properties Act. As a lawyer, I know this in England. They were the first time that women ceased to be chattels and had the right to own chattels. Well, the Prophet gave women that right during his lifetime. He says in the farewell sermon, "O people, it is true that you have certain rights with regard to women, but they also have rights over you." He's saying this 1,500 years ago. And then the other thing that I want to mention as an example is the example of the pluralism of the Prophet in terms of the covenants of the Prophet with the Ahl al-Kitab. And these are the covenants that he made with the Christians of Najran, the Christian communities of St. Catherine's Monastery, the monks of Mount Sinai. These covenants actually exist in those monasteries. They have recently been researched by a Canadian scholar, John Morrow, who's written a book about it. And these covenants were affirmed by the Fatimid Imams. So they're very, we have an ownership of these. And he was basically granting freedom of religion and protected spaces. So we have very good models in the Prophet and the Quran.
You have left us with I feel, huge responsibility. Some of the things that really resonated with me or really hitting a chord from, from this last bit is this very vivid example of unmoored ships, right? This idea of being lost at sea, really, right? When it comes to right and wrong and love and action, ethics, all of it, right? And as you were speaking, I too was thinking about some of the research done on loneliness today and the ways in which we are really suffering from an excess of this individualisticness, right? This individual to individualisticness that's kind of plaguing us. And it's not, we're seeing it everywhere, right? It's not exclusive to us. I mean, the West is suffering, I think, and there's real data to back that up. But you said it yourself, like this has left those of us, working within the communities a huge responsibility. So audience members nationally across the board, our volunteers, I hope you're listening, because this is our call to action, really, right? Is like, and it's, we are lucky to be working with a segment of the Jamaat that this is a time when we can impress upon them these values and sort of shape their way of thinking and their the value of staying low and staying open, right? Staying humble. As you mentioned, right, this idea of ignorance, arrogance, really being our downfall, this idea of the antidote to that is staying low and staying open, I think. And it's not easy to live by that. It's not easy to impart that upon our students and the people that we work with. But I think it's really good advice and a good reorientation, right? That, it's really fun to talk about Tawheed and the Ummah and these theories, but the reality that we're facing is quite dire, I think, and it puts upon us a really huge responsibility. And so, with that, we're closing up this conversation with so much wisdom, but also so much responsibility and things to think about. And, as we're about to head into our workshops where we're going to hopefully take this into a more tangible space. And so, Mr. Lakhani, I wanted to thank you truly for sharing so much of your wisdom and your experience and your time. I mean, there's so much that you have life experiences to draw upon to be able to share with us and synthesize in a way that we can't get elsewhere, right? This is not just something that we can pick up and say, oh yeah, like your unique background, I think, and life experiences are what allows you to offer such, specific insight for the work that we need to do. And I'm really grateful that you took the time to do that for us. Any last things you want to share?
Well, I'd like to just say, as you head into the workshops, that you should focus on trying to understand what a community is. Let me just offer a few pointers. Community is not merely an association. It is not merely doing life together. It is not, getting together in social get-togethers, superficial encounters. A bunch of Facebook friends might be described as a community, but it's not a community. Hajima made the distinction, I think it was at Brown, between, connection and connectivity. You have to ask the question whether the groups are providing any meaningful intimacy, sustaining care. We don't want placebo communities. Proximity is not community. The mere coinciding of individual interests is not community. So community is a commitment to shared principles and values. It is a group of individuals who share mutual concern for each other's welfare. The community, the idea of community, grows out of working through all the problems and developing stages of friendship, which involve meaningful sacrifices and acts of enlightened self-fulfillment. You remember Hajj Imamat, the Canadian parliamentary address in 2014, commented that what his work involves is not sort of charity or philanthropy, but enlightened self-fulfillment. Why is it enlightened self-fulfillment? Because when you give to the whole, you are giving to something that includes you, something greater than you that includes you. So this is quite different from individualistic pursuits. the affectations of egotism in society. It is working for the common good. I've said enough about the centrifugal forces, about the spiritual entropy, but you need to actually think through in your own environments. What sort of erosion are we seeing of the sense of the sacred? What kind of hold is scientific secularism having on society? Is it promoting atheism? Is it promoting New Ageism? How is New Ageism different from the fundamentals of our faith? Are we seeing a decline in ethical standards with the culture wars, gender fluidity, same-sex marriage? I've spoken about these issues to the Canadian Viazine. These are issues that I think that we need to think about. So are there individualistic preoccupations? Are we seeing degrading marriages, degrading families, degrading societies? Are we seeing more relativism, a usurping of principles, a rejection of authority? In other words, are we seeing what Haj Imam calls cynicism? And you know, that also deters civic engagement. We're seeing the need for better civic engagement and the world to pull together rather than come apart at the time of climate crisis and COVID and the technology challenges that we have. So these are all things that you need to think about in your workshops. What are the centrifugal forces? What are the forces of fragmentation? And the answer, I think, at the end of the day has to be found in faith and ethics, as Haj Imam says. Dostoevsky, one of his characters, Ivan Karamazov, says, if there is no God, everything is permitted. And so, you know, we need to import God. We need to understand not just God as a concept, but God as a reality. And remember the supreme commandments in the Gospel of Matthew: love of God and love of neighbor. The rights that we have over each other, as the second part of the Surah Al-Nisa said, are dependent on our rights in terms of God. It is by virtue of love of God that we can end up loving our neighbor. Faith is, in other words, the foundation for tolerance. There are spiritual roots for tolerance, as Haj Imam said in one of his speeches. So we need to cultivate ethical literacy. You know the University of Alberta speech. I think I probably put it in my handout, where Haj Imam talks about creating, you know, societies that are ethically literate, people who see the world through the lens of ethics. He even talks about ethical leadership being very important. And culture is very important, because I see culture as a way to bridge the tensions between individuality and belonging. And how does that happen? Through a sense of shared values. You know, I just leave you with these thoughts. At the end of the day, you know, we're all serving the same cause. We have to go back to the roots to rediscover the meaning of service. And for practical steps, let me just mention a couple of programs you might consider. For many years, I dealt with the book holdings and literature functions for the ITREB in Canada. And I was privy to some hidayah on that from the 1980s, where Haj Imam said in that context that we need to create intellectual watering holes. That was his expression. Intellectual watering holes in the Jamaat. Are we doing that? And secondly, when I was member for education in the early 1980s, we had the most successful debating program in the country, and we were beating all comers outside the community. The head of the Canadian Students Debating Federation came to me and said, "How are you doing this? We are experiencing defections. They're coming and, you know, debating under the Ismaili banner." Debates are a way to engage youngsters who might not have otherwise a commitment to community. So I'll leave you with that as well.
I appreciate this so much. As you heard, there's lots of nuggets here. So I'm not going to qualify this anymore. I'm going to say thank you once more so much for your time.